When I finished graduate school with a degree in research methodology and philosophy of science, I also had the opportunity during that time to study the newly emerging field of program evaluation, largely within the context of education. I studied with one of the founders of sort of a qualitative approach to evaluation, Egon Guba. He was my thesis advisor. And I eventually took his position after he retired at Indiana University. And with the late Bob Wolf, who was an advocate of something that was called the judicial model of evaluation, which pretty much sounds like what you think it would be, where there were sort of teams of advocates on both sides of an issue, and they would argue out the merits of a particular program or policy. When I came out of graduate school at that time, the job market was quite thin, so I took a position in private industry as an evaluator. And worked for 2 or 3 years doing lots of different kinds of evaluation in organizational settings. And came to appreciate the practical realities of what it meant to evaluate interventions in organizations. But I also increasingly grew skeptical of the fact that evaluation, to me, largely seemed to be only concerned with the tools for the trade, so to speak. In an earlier part, before I had done my PhD, I had spent time in seminary, and I spent a lot of time thinking about moral obligations and values and the kind of values that people bring to social enterprises, whether it's a scientist or whether it's an accountant or what have you. And I got increasingly interested in the extent to which evaluation was neglecting what I thought was a kind of moral imperative that was attached to evaluating social interventions. So I wrote a paper with the rather imposing title of Recapturing Moral Discourse in Evaluation, which got a lot of attention. And from then on, I kept working in the field of trying to develop more thoughtful theoretical perspectives on taken for granted issues in evaluation, things like that had to do not simply with the ethics of the professional ethics of evaluator behavior, but the ethics of the enterprise itself. Much like we would talk about how science has a social imperative of some kind to, say, improve the public good. Well, what was that imperative for evaluation? How was that imperative linked, or is that imperative linked to a kind of modernist impulse to constantly scrutinize ourselves, all right? And to always subject what we are doing to rigorous evaluation. And I've written extensively about those kinds of issues for several years. In the last few years, I've been particularly interested in evaluation as a form of argumentation. What does it mean to make an argument for the value of a policy or program? And I've not limited myself to thinking about those in the arena of education. That neatly dovetailed in the last 4 or 5 years with a role I've had on the National Research Council Committee, which is called the Committee for Social Science Evidence for Use. And we've spent a great deal of time discussing, first of all, what scientific evidence is, how scientific evidence is marshaled in a particular way to support certain kinds of assertions we make as scientists or evaluators, and how that scientific evidence in turn is marshaled in yet a different way when it is part of a policy argument. And so that now has gripped my attention for the last few years, and I've been writing about, broadly speaking, the nature of evidence and argumentation in evaluation, always arguing that evaluation is primarily an argument for the value of something made on a particular occasion to a particular audience for a particular reason. And that understanding the issues that are involved in that, not least of which are issues around what it means to argue, informal logic, styles of argumentation, and so on, dialogue, etc., have been sort of foremost in my mind. That work has just been an extension of a long tradition here at Illinois that was begun almost 40 years ago with Bob Stake in the Searcy Center for Evaluation. But we've maintained that kind of strong national and international presence in evaluation over the years by continually hiring people who are leaders in the field. Again, Jennifer Green came about the same time I did to Illinois and brought a particular perspective on evaluation and mixed methods. Stafford Hood is here. We probably are the leading center in the world for preparing people to be evaluators in the public sector.